We the people. That is, of course, how the Constitution of the longest standing democratic republic in the world begins. But in the turmoil of the last few years in the United States, author Tom Nichols argues in his new book that the people are currently part of the problem. The book is called Our Own Worst Enemy: The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. He's a columnist for USA Today, a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and Tom Nichols joins us now from Middletown, Rhode Island for more. Tom, it's good to have you on the program again. How you doing?
Good, Steve. Good to see you again.
Pleasure to have you on. Now, we had you on in 2017 to discuss your last book, The Death of Expertise, about the growing distrust of experts in too many parts of your country. Did writing that book inevitably lead to this one?
I wouldn't say inevitably, but it was sort of haunting me in the background, because the problem that I talk about in this book is to some extent the same problem that was sort of lurking underneath the book about knowledge and experts and why people won't listen to them. And in fact, I even mentioned in the previous book that I thought perhaps a pandemic might snap people out of it, and it didn't. And that problem is narcissism, that we have become an affluent, we in the developed world, in the United States especially, but in other countries as well, we've become an affluent, narcissistic, self-centered society, and you can't sustain a democracy on narcissism and self-centeredness.
Before we dive into that thesis more, I did want to ask you about the tone of this book compared to the last one. It seemed to me in the last book that your tone was more one of, well, more that you were saddened. You were saddened about the fact that America, so much of America, doesn't appreciate the value of expertise. But in this book, you seem, if I may say, Tom, you seem downright angry and are much more furious about America's descent into stupidity, or a lot of it's anyway. Have I got that right?
Angry, and it's also, there's a certain amount of, I think, pain in the book, because it's autobiographical in places. I talk about my own upbringing and growing up in a factory town in Massachusetts. And it's a combination of anger and frustration and exasperation and a painful realization that this democracy that has lasted over 2 centuries is being endangered, not by foreign enemies, not by a Great Depression, not by a cataclysm or a natural disaster, but simply by stubbornness and childishness and a kind of resentful sense that, no one is the boss of you, which then bleeds into really, uncivic and at times dangerous behavior.
You do lay much of the blame for the rise of illiberalism and this distrust of elites at the feet of the people themselves. What is the likelihood, don't take this the wrong way, Tom, but what is the likelihood that you, a university professor and author, are the right messenger to send this message to that group of folks?
I wrestled with this in the book because I'm a university professor now, but I grew up in a very working class, gritty neighborhood. My parents were not educated people. They were high school dropouts. We had, as I point out in the book, we suffered through a lot of the dysfunctions that afflict working class families back in the 1960s and 70s, including financial trouble and alcoholism and violence and all the things that happen to normal families in bad times. And in fact, at one point, I wondered, have I been part of the problem at both ends of my life? Was I part of the problem coming up as a young man in those days? I mean, I was as likely as a young teenager to go to jail as I was to go to college, and then later in my life. So I hope I'm the right messenger, because I've lived, I've made that transition from one group to another, from one class to another, and I hope that I have a little bit of distance on it. But I don't know that anyone's the right messenger for it, because it's very hard to turn to your fellow citizens and say, maybe you're the problem. Maybe it isn't globalization. Maybe it isn't Jeff Bezos. Maybe it isn't the Chinese. Maybe the problem with our democracy is right here in front of us in the mirror. And that's never a pleasant thing to have to say to anybody.
Let's do an excerpt from the book. This is from Our Own Worst Enemy by Tom Nichols. Authoritarian systems are the authors of their own troubles and deserve every molecule of the opposition they face from within. But why are people who are already free and who are, by any relative measure materially and politically, better off than in those more repressive states, attacking their own systems of government? The answers are as disturbing as they are counterintuitive. We are losing because we won. We are suffering because we are successful. We are unhappy because we have what we want. Now, obviously, that is not the message that we've become accustomed to hearing over the last 5 years, particularly since Donald Trump arrived on the scene. What are you seeing that so many others apparently are not seeing?
One thing I did in the book was to try to take a longer view than just the last 5 years. I mean, Donald Trump is this kind of black hole that warps all of the light around it. I think people on both the right and the left have a tendency to focus on Trump as some unique phenomenon. I tried to take a longer view of this over about 40 or 50 years and across countries. Remember, this attack on democracy is not unique to the United States. It's happening in Italy, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in Turkey, in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, in India. And I think that this is paradoxically because of peace and prosperity. Democracies can cope with almost any challenge except boredom. And in the book, I talk a bit about the prophetic voices that saw this coming. Christopher Lasch saw this coming when he talked about narcissism in 1979. But even further back, Eric Hoffer warned that in a book called The True Believer, that I think people need to start reading again as well, that when you have a middle class that's bored out of its mind, you are ripe for a mass movement because people have this need to feel some sort of meaning in their life. And so they want to go and invent great crusades. Part of that is to convince people. And part of the reason, Steve, I think that when you say this is not the message we've had over the past 5 years, we've developed a political culture in a lot of countries that is constantly premised on telling the voters that things are the worst they've ever been. These are the worst times ever. No one has ever suffered like you. No one has ever seen the kind of deprivations you're living in. And of course, this is nonsense. This is just, in most times in history, it's been nonsense. But certainly in the early 21st century, it's nonsense on stilts. But, nobody runs for election by saying, everyone's doing well, but we could do better. My opponent is a good person, but I think I can do a better job. You don't motivate people that way, and you certainly don't motivate them through social media that way. And so we've created a culture that says you are a victim. The world has screwed you over. Everything is terrible, and someone is to blame. And if you elect me, I'll hurt those other people, and I'll get even on your behalf. And again, you cannot sustain a democracy on that kind of behavior. You just can't.
Well, it doesn't, let me suggest it doesn't have to be all of one or all of the other in order for there to be a grain of pushback against what you're talking about. For example, it's also what you just said is an empirically provable fact. The times in which we live, in many ways, have never been better for the most number of people. Having said that, globalization did shut down a lot of towns in Middle America, and there are drug problems as a result, and a lot of economic gains have been felt by the Jeff Bezoses of the world as opposed to more evenly felt across society. I mean, surely much of that is true, and much of that is a factor for the unrest in your country today, no?
There are two problems with that. First of all, as I point out in the book, having come from one of those towns, much of that deindustrial damage was actually done 30, 40, 50 years ago. And there's a point in the book where I'm talking to a friend from my hometown who points and he says, I remember when those factories were full. And I said, that's impossible. You can't possibly remember that, because when we were kids, those factories were already mostly empty. And so I talk a lot in the book about the lure of nostalgia. And so there's this assumption that, again, the data does not bear out, that somehow globalization in the past 10 years just emptied out all of these towns. The other problem with that thesis is the very poorest, at least in America, are not the people rebelling against democracy. As I say in the book, poverty, drug abuse, the undeniable impact of globalization, both good and bad, because I think the other problem is that we've decided globalization is just always bad, even though you and I are using it right now to have this discussion. Um, that we've come to somehow believe that all of this happened 10 minutes ago, but the people that are actually suffering from that are not the people that are attacking democracy. One of the things you find in the United States, as well as in Italy and the UK and other places, the most illiberal elements are middle-aged, middle-class people who are actually fairly well off. The people that attacked the US Capitol were not unemployed steelworkers. They were professional. They were accountants, dentists, real estate agents. Some of them chartered private flights to go there. This is what happens when you get a bored middle class that is fed a steady diet of propaganda about how they are the downtrodden and most aggrieved people in the world. It's such a great story to say that democracy is in trouble because the very poorest are rising up into the streets. But that's not what's actually happening. It's not what's happening in most of these countries. These are political entrepreneurs goading the middle class into believing that somehow they've been victimized. Again, a story I tell in the book of, a good friend who high school diploma, kind of like me, he grew up in a financially, economically insecure town and on the edge of poor. And he literally is telling me about how much he thinks the world is unfair while he's sitting on his boat. That's the society we've created, where middle-aged men sitting on boats think that they are victimized somehow. And so, while all of the issues you mentioned, Steve, they're real problems, but that's an argument for better policy, not for destroying democracy.
No, in fact, I do remember while watching the insurrection on your Capitol on the 6th of January earlier this year, I do remember thinking, boy, some of these folks are awfully well dressed. Well, they must have borrowed the clothes. Some of these folks have got awfully impressive wire cutters or equipment or building scaling
body armor,
devices.
Camo.
Exactly, all of that stuff. And then when I read about all of that in your book, I thought, okay, maybe there's a little more to this story than meets the eye. So yeah, okay, I'm happy you put that on the record.
It's expensive to be an insurrectionist. It takes an outlay of some serious cash to do that.
As we saw, yes, indeed. Let's talk about the chapter in your book that you devote to a study of a rural Italian community in the 1950s, and in helping understand what that was all about, may tell us a bit about today. Can you pick up that story for us?
Sure. Every student of politics, culture, anthropology, sociology, politics, this was a standard work that all of us had to read for years by an author named Edward Banfield. And Banfield was a New Dealer who got disillusioned with central planning and couldn't figure out why, despite all this government help, farms in the United States, farmers wouldn't cooperate with each other. And he goes to the University of Chicago and he kind of works on this as a problem. And then he goes to Italy. And that's when it occurs to him that the problem with development is not in the institutions or the laws or the policies that you can pass, but that you don't get very far with any of that if people simply won't cooperate with each other. And what he found in this Italian village was that development, and he was mostly writing about poverty, not democracy, but it turned out to be a study of democracy, that if you only care about yourself and your immediate relatives, your children and yourself, that you actually end up poorer and worse off than if you were part of a community that volunteers, that you work together, you engage in honest commercial relations with each other, and so on. And I resurrected this book, not just because it's a classic in the genre, but because I want people to understand we are de-evolving as a democracy. We are literally moving backwards away from a very civic society, the kind that we know in North America, in the United States, and Canada, that Banfield, this professor, thought so highly of. We are actually going backward toward becoming like this Italian village in the 1950s. And I did that because as I was watching a lot of the events of the past 5 or 6 years, especially, people were saying things that were practically right out of this study in the 1950s, when people say things like, well, there was a school teacher in this Italian village who said, No one really respects anyone trying to get ahead. There's a great envy of education and wealth, and everyone distrusts anyone who's ever been elected to office, and on and on. So I put this in as a challenge to people in the democracies to say, if this sounds like you, think about that. Think about how, what that means.
Let me pick up on two words that you've used already today: narcissism and nostalgia. And to that end, you could argue that 4 decades of narcissism and nostalgia have us focused on Ronald Reagan, for example, who famously said, "Government is not the solution to your problem, government is the problem." And there was also Margaret Thatcher, his contemporary from the United Kingdom, who said there's no such thing as society. There's individual men and women, and there are families. People must look after themselves first. And let me emerge with this question. Is this distrust of government and a more sort of self-interested approach to citizenship, do you think we're at the inevitable endpoint of that worldview 4 decades later?
I don't think so. And I can't speak to the Thatcher quote, but I've always thought that the Reagan quote was out of context, because to understand, I mean, I was a voter in 1980, and to understand what Reagan said in 1980, you had to have lived through the 70s. And the notion that a lot of Americans had that government simply was getting in the way of better solutions to a lot of social problems. The Reagan administration thought government could do a lot of good things, just not most of the things that it was doing by 1980. I actually identify the 1970s and the early 1970s as the starting point of a lot of this kind of cultural rot. Remember, the 70s were famously dubbed the me decade. And that once we came out of a sort of permanent youth culture after the 60s, and we monetized it, because this is, in a way, the book is a critique of capitalism as well. Once we consumerized everything, we were already on the path to ruin. I think, there's no arguing that the conservative movement definitely had an impact on the notion of, self-reliance and less involvement with government. But I still think that the original sin here is the permanent institutionalizing of a consumerist, youth-oriented culture that encouraged us to follow our every whim, to never get older, to never grow up, to never be responsible. And I think that really begins in the early 1970s. And then accelerates actually after the end of the Cold War, when we just lose any sense of seriousness about anything. I mean, in some ways, if I'm nostalgic, I'm almost nostalgic for the 1980s, because it feels like we took things, including politics, a lot more seriously than we did after 1990.
Well, let me follow up with this delicious quote from your book. You say, "We can now get from hello to I hate you faster and at a greater distance than any generation of humans who have ever lived." How delighted are you with what social media have done to us?
That's a hard question to answer, because I'm part of the problem. I'm a technological optimist. I came of age when the internet did. I'm kind of a computer nerd myself, but social media has been deeply destructive in the way that we as people have used it. Again, this is a problem that requires us to look in the mirror. And part of the problem with social media is that you are really mostly rewarded for negative interactions. And for a lot of people, social media has become the equivalent of coming home and kicking the dog, that you just reach out and lash out at other human beings because it just makes you feel better about your day. And you don't really have to think about the fact that you're hurting other people's feelings or saying terrible things to other human beings. And I've been guilty of it. I get snippy with people on social media. I have a large Twitter account. But I think this is where it does dovetail. Steve, you asked me at the beginning of our discussion about the death of expertise. It's also a source of alternative, I won't even say information, of alternative views of reality, like rabbit holes that people fall into and become completely irrational about. And so you have this 1-2 punch of an encouragement to be our very worst selves anonymously from behind a keyboard and be just horrible to other people, but also to live in worlds that aren't real and to believe in things that simply are not true. And at some point, if knowledge and virtue, as I quote the founders of the American Republic repeatedly, John Adams, James Madison, others pointed out, knowledge and virtue are the pillars of a representative democracy. And if we lose both of them, we lose everything.
We are in danger of losing those right now. I appreciate your deep concern about that. I also note, and you and I are about the same age here, we certainly never grew up with anything in government akin to a ministry of loneliness, which they have in the United Kingdom right now. There are just a lot of people out there who are feeling alone and atomized, and they don't see any particular way out of that as well. And I wonder, as you sort of add it all up, do you see a way out of all of this for us?
I hope that some of that will dissipate with the end of the pandemic. But of course, these uncivic attitudes that have especially arisen in the United States during the pandemic are keeping us locked in this kind of empty, lonely existence because we simply can't get past it. I think at this point today, we're over 700,000 deaths in the United States. But I think, again, people have to make choices. They need to step away from their computers. They need to turn off their televisions. Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute, now at the Atlantic, and a few other folks have said simple things like take a walk, go outside. And it seems like this really anodyne, condescending advice, but that is important. And I think one way to get past this, people have become obsessed with issues at the national level, particularly here in the United States, and pay almost no attention to anything happening at the local level. One cure for all of this is to know what's going on in your community. I was in a store here in Rhode Island the other day, and there were like 6 local newspapers from all the towns that surround me. And it was just it just warmed my heart, that if you really want to know what was going on in the communities along the Sakonnet River, they have a newspaper and you should read it. But instead, people want to go online and say, I'm going to solve, racial problems in the United States. I'm going to solve the deficit. I'm going to solve, these gigantic problems of social unrest. And that is, again, a narcissistic sense of heroism that tells you that simply being an involved member of your community is beneath you or not enough for you somehow. And so I would appeal to people to say, get away from this constant rush of narcissistic gratification and do some of the boring things. I spent 2.5, almost 3 years working in state and local government, and I can tell you that's where everything gets done. But it's boring. It's not as much fun as working. And I worked in the U.S. Senate. It's not as much fun as working in the Senate. But if you really want to figure out how the potholes get filled and how your garbage gets picked up, that's where it happens. And I think that's where people need to focus. And then the rest kind of solves itself over time.
Your story reminds me of the fact that Canada was engaged in trying to repatriate its constitution from the United Kingdom for about 120 years before we finally did it. And oh my God, you want to talk about an obsessive cottage industry for so many folks. It got to the point where somebody once said, I believe in the open window theory of constitutional reinvigoration. And everybody said, what does that mean? The guy said, it means opening up the window and looking out it, and that's it. And that's not a bad thing to remember from time to time. Yeah. Opening up the window, looking out it, seeing the beauty of the world, and giving everything else a rest for a while. I'd like to give the last word to your dad on this, who gave quite a brilliant answer, as you've described it in the book, when you asked him whether he was voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. What was his answer?
Well, I have to set the stage by telling you that my father, an intelligent and well-informed but uneducated man born in the early 20th century, my dad had a lot of pretty retrograde political views. I mean, he was a bigot. He was a misogynist. He was, your typical white working class, blue collar to gray collar worker. And he was one of the Democrats. He was an FDR Democrat who left the Democratic Party here in America after '68, and then became a Nixon voter and a Reagan voter and so on. And yet, at the end of his life, he was in his 90s, and we were watching President Obama speak. And no matter what my father's views about race or anything else. He never spoke ill. He was old school. You didn't speak ill of the president of the United States. You just didn't. It was something you didn't do. And I said, I knew my father, was Republican. He was voting for Romney, and we were from Massachusetts. And I said, Dad, I don't think it's going to happen. I think, president's going to get reelected. And my father just nodded, and he really surprised me. He never got a chance to vote. He died just a few weeks before the election. But he said, they're both good men. We're going to be fine no matter who wins. And that really struck me. And I start the book with that story because that's where I want us to get back to, where we can look at each other and say, listen, these are good people. We're going to be fine no matter who wins. And instead of this catastrophizing where we think every election is the end of the world and we are on the side of the angels and light, and the people across from us, on our street are, the army of darkness. And I thought if my father could do it after 94 years of, being poor and being a bigoted guy and all the things my father went through, if he could sit there and look at Barack Obama and Mitt Romney and say, these are both good men, we're going to be fine. If he could do it, any of us could do it.
Amen. Great story. Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, is Tom Nichols' latest. We're so grateful, as always, you find time for us here on TVO, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us, as always.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.